Oleksandr, it's great to see you today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure.
So, Oleksandr, aside from being a member of parliament and the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, you taught international law for many years. So I'm really curious, looking at what's going on now, where the U.S. seems to be disinterested in continuing its support for Ukraine and seems to be moving off the scene, what do you make of that? And what argument would you make to an American that supports that thinks that Ukraine is simply not their problem, and that anything that happens in Europe is, frankly, a European problem?
Well, it is a problem and a serious issue for the United States because, first of all, Europe itself and Ukraine is a part of Europe. It's, to use the headline of Ukrainian historian Plokhy, it's a gate of Europe. So European security depends on Ukraine. And for the United States, Europe as such has extremely important, it has strategic importance. And even strategically speaking, it's important for the United States to have peace and security because it's a huge market. And without Ukraine, there will be a hegemony of Russia. And it will be a constant threat to Europe, to its economic, political, and even cultural life. So the United States should care about the situation in Ukraine. A second reason is that I would like to remind you the phrase which Vice President J.D. Vance said. He said that the new sheriff is in town. And for us, the United States has always played the role of a sheriff, even though, to use the phrase of Richard Haas, reluctant sheriff, sometimes reluctant. But, sheriff is supposed to care about law and order. And the issue of Ukraine is about law and order in the whole world, because Ukraine is a victim of the crime of aggression committed by Russia against our country. And the crime of aggression is such a crime which is a crime not only against particular state, it's a crime against the whole international global community, including the United States. So even for legal or moral reason, the United States should continue to support Ukraine and to care about what's going on in Europe.
So that makes a lot of sense. But if Americans simply aren't interested, they just don't want to be involved because it's Europe. Europe has enough money. They can afford weapons. They can afford to assist Ukraine. Why do the Americans specifically have to get involved? I mean, a lot of Americans, frankly, think that what's happening in eastern Ukraine is simply Russia taking back territories that historically have been a part of Russia, that a lot of Russian speakers and the people there will continue to live now just happily as Russian citizens. But that's not the case. What's really going on in eastern Ukraine, the occupied territories?
Well, as for the temporarily occupied by Russia territories of Ukraine, first of all, we know about this, what was going on when we managed to liberate the territories previously occupied by Russians. I mean, for example, Bucha and Irpin. And this is typical picture of what's going on in these territories. And the truth is that people living in the whole territory of Ukraine, including occupied territories, they have Ukrainian identity. They are Ukrainian citizens. It's not even the first generation, because it's been 30 years since the collapse of Soviet Union and since independence of Ukraine. And people living in the occupied territories, they are subjected to terror from Russian occupying authorities because Russia is conducting the war of genocide against Ukraine. And it's trying to erase, especially in the occupied territories, erase all traces of being Ukrainian, of Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian identity. So, and that's why people who are temporarily under occupation, they are victims of this occupation. They live in terrible, horrible conditions. But I would like to remind you what was in the beginning, after the full-scale invasion. We saw, for example, when Russia had managed briefly occupy, for example, Kherson or other cities in Ukraine, immediately it has sparked numerous demonstrations, rallies against occupation. And people living in those territories have been brave enough to take to the streets and to oppose Russian occupation, to express their indignation. So now, after several years of occupation, we know the situation is difficult. To preserve your Ukrainian identity, it might be a problem which might lead to death. It's too dangerous. But nevertheless, people continue to support Ukraine as much as they can, and they continue to be Ukrainians who want these territories to be deoccupied and to be returned to Ukraine.
So, Alexander, that is true. There's been a lot of news, especially after Bucha and Irpin, of what happens in Russian occupation. But I think one side of the story that a lot of Americans don't hear about is specifically the persecution of Christians. Is it really as bad as what it sounds like?
Well, it is. It reminds maybe even the times of Roman Empire when the Christians were persecuted. I had meetings several times with the Council of Churches. And this Council of Churches includes all denominations, all religions in Ukraine, including Protestants, evangelicals, and the people who are Protestants. They described situation in the occupied territories. There are people, Protestant pastors, for example, who were persecuted and who were subjected to tortures by Russians. So, and situation with religion and freedom of religion in the occupied by Russian territories is really dramatic. It's dramatic, and it's again, it's dangerous to be a true Christian in the occupied territories, because Russia is using the so-called Russian Orthodox Church as a tool in its war against Ukraine. It's a tool of genocide of Ukrainians, and it's a tool of suppression of the freedom of religion in the occupied territories.
You mentioned the Russian Orthodox Church being an instrument of Russian propaganda and of suppressing people in occupied territories. But Russia globally is very active using propaganda and disinformation, especially in the global south, in Africa and Latin America. And at the beginning of the war, Ukraine was not nearly as active in those regions as Russia. Has that changed? Is Ukraine doing more now to reach out to these countries?
Yeah, it's true that Russia pumps billions of dollars into a propaganda machine, including Russian propaganda and Russian political influence in the global south, including Africa, Latin America. I myself, I've been recently, a few months ago, I visited several Latin American countries like Ecuador, Colombia, Uruguay, and Argentina. And I had my firsthand experience about how Russia is using its leverage, its influence, and its propaganda in these countries. For us, the countries of the global south, including Africa, Latin America, Asia, they have become our strategic priority. And we are trying to reach out to these countries. We're trying to find our friends. We're trying to explain to the population, to the people living in those countries, what's going on. We're trying to make them understand the danger which Russia presents not only for Ukraine, but for the whole global security and peace, including those regions. For example, there are such instruments of parliamentary diplomacy which we use as our parliamentary delegation at the Interparliamentary Union, which encompasses more than 100 countries and members of parliament. We also participate as observer at the Parliamentary Assembly of ASEAN countries in the Southeast Asia. So we are trying to use each opportunity to use, for example, bilateral meetings with members of parliament of different countries, or using online meetings, for instance, to establish direct communication and to tell the truth about realities, about what's going on, about Russian aggression. And it's very important. And luckily, we find understanding from these countries. And the most recent example of Ukrainian diplomacy, the recent visit of President Zelensky to the South Africa, which is a difficult country for us, because South Africa, unfortunately, tended to be, in a way, pro-Russian and pro-Chinese. Yes, and it's difficult. But nevertheless, you know, each time when a representative of Ukraine comes to such country, it's already a victory, to use the phrase of one of our ambassadors. It is a victory, because if you're not present, there is a void, there is vacuum, which is immediately filled by Russian propaganda. That's why it's crucially important for us to establish direct communication with our counterparts, with people in the global south.
So that's very interesting. Tell me more about that. What did you learn in your trip specifically to Latin America, to Ecuador, Argentina, Uruguay, and these other countries? What did you find out?
I found out that there are more people when the third before who understand what's going on, who don't succumb to Russian propaganda and Russian narratives. But it's important to have a direct sort of conversation with them, because I agree with what President Biden once said, that he said that international relations are, in the final analysis, are interpersonal relations. And interestingly, President Trump also mentioned something like that. So it's like a common knowledge in the US that to have a success in diplomacy, you should directly communicate. And when we talk to our counterparts, we manage to explain to them and to bring them on our side, or rather, even I'm not talking even on the side of Ukraine. I'm talking more about the side of international law, because for me, the whole issue is broader than just an act of aggression of Russia against Ukraine. It's about international order and it's about international law. And each country should be interested in preventing aggression, in preventing genocide. And that's why we find support and understanding among different people in the countries of global south.
That's an interesting perspective to have. And as a former professor of international law, I'd be curious, how does it work if there's a peace agreement or a ceasefire? Does that have to go through the Verkhovna Rada, which is the parliament of Ukraine, or is that something that the president can just sign? What's the actual process and how long does it take?
Well, first of all, according to our constitution, what kind of international agreements require ratification or consent of the Verkhovna Rada? Not all international agreements. For example, political and military agreements, they are not international treaties. They are, there is no need for them to be ratified by the parliament. I mean, for example, let's recall Minsk Accords. They didn't need any ratification by the Verkhovna Rada because it was not an international treaty. It was political military agreement about ceasefire. It was its essence of this agreement. So it depends on the nature, on the content of such an agreement, if it will be reached. But we distinguish between ceasefire agreement and peace agreement. As for peace agreement, it's very distant. It's very distant. We don't know whether at all it's possible. It might take even generations. But we're talking about immediate kind of agreement, which is ceasefire agreement. And usually ceasefire agreements, they don't need ratification of the parliament because by their nature, they're political and military. They're kind of temporary agreements. That's why it depends again on the nature and the content of such agreement. And also it depends on the president, because who can subject such agreement to the ratification by the parliament? According to our legislation, it can be either the president, who is responsible for foreign policy, or the cabinet of ministers.
So that's really interesting. Now, since we're on the topic of international law, I'd be really curious how you perceive the current peace negotiations that the US is trying to lead. It seems very problematic to me that the United States is not interested in security guarantees. And as any other contract, enforceability as well as sanction, what happens if somebody doesn't comply with the agreement, is the key part. Otherwise, it's just a promise. If somebody knows there's going to be no sort of punishment and they will just be able to do whatever they want, and there's no one who's going to be bringing them to justice, why would they stick to the agreement? So is that true? Is that also true with peace agreements? Isn't there also enforceability and sanction?
Well, from the perspective of international law, enforceability of international treaties is problematic because unlike national legal system in which we have contracts and which are enforced by the state, we don't have superstate standing above the states. That's why we have here what is known as a self-help principle, which means basically if an international treaty is violated, what can happen? the party to the international treaty which had suffered can protect its interests only independently. It cannot call 911, it cannot call world police or something like that. And of course, this is one of the reasons why we need reliable security guarantees if we manage to reach, for example, ceasefire agreement. But most importantly is the fact that the other party, I mean Russia, I mean Putin, they have absolutely no credibility as a partner. Putin had violated all kinds of agreements concluded between Russia and Ukraine, including the Budapest Memorandum, including Treaty of 1997, concluded between Russia and Ukraine, which contained guarantee of our territorial integrity. The Minsk Accords were also violated by Putin. So the thing is that Putin is absolutely not trustworthy. And the logical question arises, how can you make a deal? How can you reach an agreement with someone who in the past didn't observe, didn't comply with the reached agreements, and who has no intention to do it in the future? And the only thing which can be done is to receive reliable security guarantees. From whom? From someone whom Putin is afraid of. And this someone happens to be the United States. So that's why this agreement about ceasefire is not going to work at all unless we receive reliable security guarantees from the United States. The best such security guarantee, of course, would be NATO membership, because it's the only deterrent in the mind of Putin, the only thing which can truly deter Putin from attacking us again. NATO membership. And it's the cheapest way, by the way, to guarantee security of Ukraine in case of ceasefire agreement.
Security guarantees absolutely are necessary for Ukraine. It simply makes no sense otherwise. How can we trust Russia, which routinely violates its treaties that it signed, to this time be a good guy about it and not violate international law? It's totally unrealistic. So based upon that, Ukraine definitely needs to be in NATO or get guarantees. NATO at this point, though, seems that it might be a little bit out of reach. There's countries in NATO that do not support Ukraine joining. So based upon that, we're left with security guarantees. Is Ukraine currently negotiating or looking at other security guarantees or other methods of guaranteeing its security in the face of future Russian aggression?
The truth is that the answer to this question depends on the Putin's mind, because the key issue is what can deter him from attacking Ukraine again. What in his eyes would be reliable security guarantees for Ukraine, which would prevent him from a new armed attack. And of course, NATO, number one. But before we join NATO, we should think really hard what can be security guarantees. Maybe we can use as a model Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty and create a coalition of the willing, for example, who those countries who care about European security, global security, and who will be eager to provide the necessary military assistance and support for Ukraine. But again, in this coalition of the willing, we need presence and active role played by the United States. Why? Because for us, it's the best security guarantee. And it's deterrent, powerful enough deterrent in the eyes of Putin. Another kind of security guarantee I've been recently talking about is about our membership in the European Union. I'll explain why, because it's also an important issue for us. I always give as an example Finland. Finland was not a NATO member state, but at the same time, it was the EU member. And Putin didn't dare to attack Finland, because he knew that if he attacks Finland, it will be supported by other member states of the European Union. And he will be waging war not only against one country, against Finland, but against the whole international organization, quasi-federation, the European Union. That's why for us to join the European Union is a kind of, it's not as reliable as the NATO, but at the same time, it's important security guarantee. And I would like also to mention that within the European Union, there is something which is known as common security and defense policy. So it's like a beginning of security system within the European Union. And this common security and defense policy can be developed when Ukraine joins the European Union. And it might create additional security guarantee for Ukraine.
Oleksandr, that's fascinating. Thank you for all your time today.
Thank you.